boy stood in the hospital lobby, jacket soaked through with rain, small fingers gripping the sleeve of a stranger. "Please help, my mommy is crying," he begged, eyes red as he pointed toward the corner where a young woman sat curled around her own pain, trying to hide her tears. Mason Carter almost walked past without stopping until the harsh overhead light caught her face fully, and something inside him went still. It was not simply a stranger in distress. It was a past he believed had been buried forever, staring back at him through a child's frightened eyes. If you want to know why Mason fell to his knees before her, stay with this story to the end. The rain had been falling over Chicago since early evening, turning the streets into rivers of reflected light, and the private hospital on the north side of the city glowed like an island of glass and steel against the storm. Mason Carter arrived that night for a single purpose. He was set to finalize the acquisition of a struggling regional medical network, a deal his lawyers had been preparing for months, and he intended to be in and out within the hour. Mason was known throughout the business world as a man who never allowed sentiment to interfere with strategy. Colleagues called him precise. Rivals called him cold. He had built an empire on the principle that emotion was a liability, and for years that principle had served him without exception. He stepped through the sliding doors with his coat still dry beneath an umbrella his driver had insisted on, and he was already reaching for his phone when a small hand caught the edge of his sleeve. He looked down, startled, and found a boy no older than 6 standing there, soaked from the storm outside, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The boy's eyes were wide and red-rimmed, his voice trembling as he begged for help. He said his mother was crying and that nobody would come. Mason's first instinct was to summon security, to hand the problem off the way he handed off every inconvenience that did not belong to him. He opened his mouth to call for an orderly, but something in the boy's desperation held him in place a moment longer than it should have. The child pointed down the long corridor toward a woman seated alone on a bench near the far wall, her shoulders curled inward, one arm wrapped tightly around her middle as though she were trying to hold herself together by force. Mason followed the boy's gaze out of simple curiosity, nothing more, a passing courtesy before he would move on to the meeting that actually mattered to him. Then the overhead light shifted as a nurse passed between them, and for one unguarded second it fell directly across the woman's face. Mason stopped walking entirely. His chest tightened in a way it had not tightened in years, a physical memory rising before his mind could catch up to it. He knew that face. He had spent a great deal of energy convincing himself he never wanted to see it again. And yet here it was, worn thinner by time and hardship, but unmistakably hers. The boy tugged at his sleeve again, unaware that he had just delivered his mother's name into a man's chest like a blade. Mason's driver called out behind him, asking if something was wrong, and Mason did not answer. He could not have answered, even if he tried. Every carefully built wall inside him had gone suddenly and completely silent. The woman on the bench had not yet looked up. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to swallow whatever pain had brought her to that hallway, unaware that the boy beside her had wandered off to plead with a stranger for help. Mason took one step forward, then another, his polished shoes suddenly heavy against the tile. He had walked into that hospital as one of the wealthiest men in the state, indifferent to nearly everything around him. He walked toward her now as someone else entirely, someone he had buried a long time ago, someone who once knew exactly what it felt like to love a person without calculation. The boy watched him with wide, hopeful eyes, waiting for the stranger to finally understand. For a moment, everything around Mason seemed to fall away. The muted announcements over the hospital speakers, the squeak of nurses' shoes against tile, the distant hum of machines keeping other lives steady through the night. He was aware only of the woman on the bench, of the years that separated the person he remembered from the person now sitting there, worn down by burdens he could not yet name. Somewhere behind him, his driver waited by the doors, and somewhere across town a legal team was likely already preparing contracts for a signature that suddenly felt insignificant. None of that mattered in the moment his mind chose to linger on her face instead. Whatever version of himself had walked through those doors an hour earlier no longer felt entirely familiar to him now. Her name was Amelia Brooks, and there had been a time, long before hospital corridors and rain-soaked nights, when Mason had loved her without reservation. It was in the years before his company became a household name, when he was simply a young entrepreneur working out of a cramped office with more ambition than money, staying awake until dawn chasing contracts that might or might not save his fledgling business. Amelia had believed in him before anyone else did. She used to bring him coffee at midnight and remind him that exhaustion was not the same as failure. Those years had been difficult, but Mason often thought later that they had also been the only years in which he had been genuinely happy. Then, without warning, she disappeared from his life entirely. One week she was there, steady and certain, and the next she was gone, leaving behind nothing but silence and a handful of documents that seemed at the time to explain everything. Mason had been shown evidence suggesting she had accepted money to walk away, a payoff dressed up as a business settlement, timed precisely as his company began attracting serious investors. He had been devastated, and then he had been furious, and eventually he had convinced himself that fury was easier to carry than grief. He told himself she had simply been another person drawn to him for what he might someday become, rather than for who he actually was. What Mason did not know, what he could not have known from where he stood, was that Amelia had lived through an entirely different version of that same week. She believed Mason had chosen his rising company over her, that his family had pressured him into cutting her loose before she could become an inconvenient complication, and that his silence afterward was confirmation of a decision he had made without the courage to say it to her face. She left the city carrying that belief for years, raising her son alone in a series of small apartments, working double shifts at whatever job would take her, never once reaching out because she assumed, with the same painful certainty Mason carried, that reaching out would only humiliate her further. Neither of them had ever attempted to reach the other during those years, both convinced that any effort would simply confirm their own humiliation rather than repair anything broken between them. Amelia moved through several cities before settling in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago, choosing each apartment based on proximity to affordable childcare rather than comfort or convenience. She built a small, careful routine around Lucas, determined that whatever hardship she endured would never visibly touch him, and for years she largely succeeded, even as the effort quietly wore down her own health in ways she chose not to acknowledge. By the time she sat in that hospital corridor, Amelia had spent years building a life out of very little, refusing every form of comfort that came with strings attached. She was proud in a way that exhausted her, the kind of pride that insisted on paying every bill herself even when her body was breaking down from the effort. When Mason finally reached her that night, kneeling slightly so he could meet her eyes, she looked up at him with an expression that held no warmth at all, only exhaustion and old, unhealed anger. She told him plainly that she did not need his help and that he should walk away from her and her son the same way he had walked away once before. Mason opened his mouth to argue, but the accusation in her voice was so absolute that, for the first time in years, he found himself with nothing to say. Mason did not walk away, not truly, even though Amelia had told him to. Instead, he found the head physician overseeing her case and asked, in a tone that left no room for refusal, to be given a complete account of her condition. What he learned unsettled him more than he expected. Amelia had been suffering from a serious complication brought on by months of overwork and repeatedly delayed treatment, the kind of condition that worsened steadily when a person simply could not afford to stop working long enough to address it. Her insurance coverage had lapsed weeks earlier, and the resulting bill had been rejected outright, leaving her with a choice between her health and her ability to keep a roof over her son's head. Without telling her, Mason quietly authorized payment for the entire balance, along with whatever additional treatment the physicians recommended. He told himself it was simply the responsible thing to do, the kind of gesture any decent person would make for a former friend in crisis, though some part of him understood it was far more complicated than that. When Amelia discovered what he had done, she was furious rather than grateful. She accused him of trying to buy his way back into a life he had no right to re-enter, of using money the same way his family always had, as a tool to control people who could not afford to refuse it. Mason tried to explain that he only wanted her safe, but the word safe landed strangely between them, heavy with everything neither of them had said in years. It was during that same tense exchange, while the physician reviewed her intake forms aloud for clarity, that Mason heard a date mentioned in passing, the recorded birth date of her son Lucas. He did the arithmetic without meaning to, the numbers arranging themselves instantly against a private calendar he had never fully let go of, one built from memories of a particular autumn nearly 7 years earlier. A cold and unfamiliar feeling moved through him, something between hope and dread, and he found himself unable to look away from Amelia's face as the possibility took shape in his mind. He asked her directly whether Lucas was his son. Amelia's expression closed like a door. She told him that he had lost the right to ask that question the day he allowed his family to destroy the life she had been building, and that no amount of money could purchase back a truth he had walked away from long ago. Mason wanted to argue that he had walked away from nothing, that he had been lied to just as thoroughly as she believed she had been, but the accusation in her eyes was so absolute, so worn smooth by years of private grief, that he understood arguing would accomplish nothing that night. He left the hospital hours later without an answer, but with a growing certainty that whatever separated them had never been the simple betrayal he once believed it to be, and that somewhere in his own family's past there was a version of events he had never been permitted to see. Driving home through streets still slick from the earlier storm, Mason found himself replaying conversations from 7 years earlier, searching for details he might have missed at the time, small inconsistencies he had been too consumed by grief and anger to notice. He remembered his mother's unusual insistence on reviewing his personal correspondence during that period, an intrusion he had dismissed then as simple maternal concern for a son under enormous professional pressure. Now that same memory sat differently in his mind, less like concern and more like control. By the time he reached his own front door, he understood that the answers he needed would not come from Amelia, who had already suffered enough interrogation for one difficult night, but from his own family's carefully guarded history. The following morning, Mason returned to the Carter family estate to confront his mother, Grace Carter, a woman whose composure had been legendary in every social circle she moved through for decades. Grace had never approved of Amelia, viewing her as a distraction unworthy of the family name during the very years Mason needed to focus entirely on building his company. Grace believed, with the absolute conviction of someone who had never once doubted her own judgment, that she had simply protected her son from a costly mistake. Mason sat across from her in the same sitting room where he had once announced his engagement plans, and he asked her directly what she had done to end his relationship with Amelia all those years ago. Grace denied any involvement at first, her tone measured and faintly amused, as though the question itself were beneath serious consideration. But Mason had spent enough years reading boardrooms to recognize the particular stillness that settled over a person who was choosing every word with great care. He pressed further, laying out the timeline as he now understood it, the sudden documents, the abrupt disappearance, the payoff that conveniently coincided with his company's first major round of funding. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to surface. Grace had hired David Morgan, the family's longtime personal attorney, to construct false evidence, suggesting Amelia had accepted a settlement in exchange for leaving for Mason permanently. At the same time, Grace had gone to Amelia directly and told her that Mason had already decided, on his own, that he wanted nothing to do with a child or a relationship that might slow his ascent. Amelia, already pregnant and with no family of her own to lean on, had no resources to challenge a woman as powerful and convincing as Grace Carter. She left the city believing she had been discarded, while Mason, only days later, was shown paperwork suggesting she had left him for a payment he never authorized. Both of them had spent years grieving a betrayal that had never actually happened the way either of them believed. Mason sat in stunned silence as the full shape of it settled over him. The years of anger he had carried against a woman who had done nothing wrong, the son he had never known existed, the family loyalty that had cost him something he could never fully recover. Grace tried to justify her actions, insisting she had only ever wanted to protect the Carter legacy from what she considered an unsuitable attachment. Mason stood, his voice low and steady in a way that unsettled her more than shouting would have, and told her that whatever legacy she believed she had protected had cost him 7 years with his own child. He walked out of the estate that afternoon and ordered his legal team to reopen every financial record, every email, and every confidentiality agreement connected to that period, determined to understand exactly how far his family's deception had reached. Grace remained seated in the sitting room long after Mason left, staring at the portrait above the fireplace of her own late husband, the man who had built the family's fortune and, in Grace's mind, entrusted her with the responsibility of protecting it at any cost. She told herself, as she had told herself for 7 years, that her actions had been justified by circumstances Mason was too young and too infatuated to properly evaluate at the time. Yet some quieter part of her, one she rarely allowed herself to hear, understood that justification and truth were not always the same thing, and that the cost of her decision had ultimately fallen hardest on the one person she claimed to be protecting. Amelia, unaware of everything unfolding at the Carter estate, discharged herself from the hospital far earlier than her physicians recommended and returned to her shift at a small laundry service on the edge of the city. She could not afford to lose the job, no matter how her body protested, and the owner had already made his impatience clear after her repeated absences that week. She stood behind the counter that afternoon, pale and unsteady, folding linens with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion, telling herself the fatigue would pass the way it always eventually did. It was during a quiet stretch of the afternoon that a man she did not recognize stepped inside, lingering near the entrance long enough to make his intentions clear without saying much at all. He warned her in a voice pitched low enough that only she could hear, that certain people would prefer she said nothing further to Mason Carter about the past. He did not explain who had sent him, but something in his calm, practiced manner told Amelia this was not the first errand of its kind he had run. She recognized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty laundry room, that whatever had ended her relationship with Mason years ago had never fully disappeared. It had simply been waiting. Frightened for her son more than for herself, Amelia arranged for Lucas to stay temporarily with a trusted friend across town, reasoning that distance might buy her time to understand what she was truly facing. She said little to Lucas about why, only that he would have a small adventure for a few days, and he accepted the explanation the way children often accept adult uncertainty, with more trust than the situation deserved. Amelia spent that night packing a single bag, uncertain whether she was preparing to run or simply preparing herself for whatever came next. What Amelia did not know was that Mason, already suspicious after his conversation with Grace, had quietly assigned a small security detail to watch over her without revealing their presence. When his team reported the visit from the unfamiliar man at the laundry service, along with a description that matched known associates of David Morgan, Mason understood immediately that the threat was neither random nor finished. He had spent years building instincts sharp enough to detect danger to his company from a great distance, and those same instincts now told him that Amelia and Lucas were in real jeopardy because of decisions his own family had made long before either child existed in the story. For the first time since the hospital corridor, Mason decided he would not simply observe from a careful distance. He picked up his phone and called Amelia directly, telling her plainly that whatever she believed about him, she and her son were no longer facing this alone. Amelia hesitated before answering, her instincts still telling her to refuse any involvement from a man whose family had already cost her so much. But something in Mason's voice that evening was different from the careful, guarded tone she remembered from years earlier. Something steadier and less concerned with appearances. She told him, reluctantly, about the stranger at the laundry service and the warning he had delivered, admitting for the first time that fear rather than pride was the true reason she had kept Lucas away from his usual routines that week. Mason listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he simply told her he was coming to see her, not to take control of the situation, but to make certain she never again had to face it by herself. Mason arrived at Amelia's small apartment that same evening, insisting on speaking with her in person rather than over the phone. The building was modest, its hallway lit by a single flickering bulb, and the apartment itself was cramped in a way that told him exactly how narrow her margins had become over the years. Yet everything inside it was clean and carefully arranged, a child's drawings taped along one wall, a worn but tidy couch, the unmistakable evidence of someone who had built warmth out of very little because nothing had ever been given to her freely. Mason stood in the doorway for a long moment, absorbing the quiet dignity of a life he had spent years imagining as something far less honorable. He told her everything he had learned from Grace, laying out the falsified documents, the pressure his mother had applied, the years both of them had spent grieving a betrayal orchestrated entirely by other people. Amelia listened in silence, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as though bracing for another disappointment, and when Mason finished speaking, she did not respond right away. Instead, tears began falling that she made no effort to hide, not out of weakness, but because for the first time in 7 years, someone had finally confirmed what she had always suspected in her most private moments, that she had not simply imagined being wronged. Mason lowered himself to one knee in front of her, an instinct rather than a calculated gesture, and told her he was sorry for every year she had carried that burden alone, while he had been free to believe the worst of her without ever once questioning it properly. Amelia did not immediately forgive him. She told him plainly that an apology, however sincere, could not return the years she had spent working herself to exhaustion, could not undo the nights she had gone without proper meals so that Lucas would never notice their circumstances, could not erase the loneliness of raising a child while believing his father had chosen not to know him. Mason accepted this without argument, understanding that forgiveness was not something he could request and receive in a single evening no matter how genuine his remorse. He told her he did not expect her to trust him immediately, only that he intended to prove through consistent action what his words alone could not accomplish. Amelia studied him carefully, searching his face for the calculation she had come to expect from anyone connected to the Carter name, and found instead something that looked, for the first time in a very long while, like plain and unguarded honesty. She did not embrace him, and she did not tell him it would be simple, but she allowed him to stay a little longer that night, which was more than she had offered anyone in years. Before he left, Mason glanced once more at the drawings taped along the wall, small crayon renderings of a house, a son, a figure holding a child's hand, and he understood that Lucas had spent years imagining a family that circumstance had denied him. He said nothing about it to Amelia, sensing that the observation belonged to him alone. For now, a private ache he intended to address through action rather than words. Walking back to his car through the quiet street, Mason felt none of the satisfaction he usually associated with solving a difficult problem. Instead, he felt only the beginning of a much longer responsibility, one that no amount of wealth could shorten or simplify. In the days that followed, Mason raised the subject of a paternity test as gently as he knew how, careful to frame it as a question rather than a demand. He told Amelia he needed nothing from her, and expected nothing, but that he could not move forward without knowing the truth for certain. Amelia agreed, not because she owed him anything, but because she believed Lucas deserved clarity about his own origins, regardless of what it might cost the adults around him. She asked only one thing in return, that whatever the results revealed, Mason would not allow the discovery to disrupt her son's sense of safety. The results arrived quietly, delivered directly to Mason rather than through any public pathway, confirming what he had already suspected in his heart since that rainy night in the hospital corridor. Lucas was his son. Mason sat alone with the paperwork for a long while, saying nothing to anyone, absorbing the full weight of 7 years he could never reclaim. Birthdays he had not attended, illnesses he had not known about, ordinary evenings he had missed entirely while believing himself free of any responsibility at all. It was, he later admitted to himself, the first time in years that his wealth had felt entirely useless to him. Rather than rushing to announce himself as a father, Mason made the deliberate choice to move slowly, mindful that Lucas had no context for the sudden appearance of a man claiming that role in his life. He continued visiting the small apartment, careful and unhurried, allowing Lucas to grow familiar with his presence at whatever pace felt natural to a child who had only ever known his mother's steady, singular care. In those early visits, Lucas said little directly to Mason, though he would glance at him occasionally with open curiosity, the kind of look children give adults they have not yet decided to trust but have also not decided to fear. Mason understood that trust, once broken by an entire family's deception, could not be rebuilt through grand gestures or expensive gifts, however easily he could have afforded them. He resolved instead to address the deeper wound first, the conspiracy that had cost both Amelia and Lucas 7 years of stability, before allowing himself to step fully into a role he had never been given the chance to claim. He returned to his legal team with a new and far more personal urgency, determined that whoever had engineered his family's betrayal would answer for it in full, before he allowed himself to focus on anything resembling a future with his son. There were quiet moments, late at night, when Mason allowed himself to sit with the full sorrow of what had been taken from him, birthdays celebrated without him, a first day of school he had never witnessed, small milestones that other fathers documented casually and that he would only ever hear about secondhand, if at all. He did not indulge the sorrow for long, unwilling to let self-pity distract him from the more urgent work of protecting his son's future, but he allowed himself to feel it fully at least once, understanding that suppressing it entirely would only delay a grief that deserved acknowledgement. David Morgan, sensing that Mason's investigation was drawing dangerously close to the truth, moved quickly to protect himself and the version of events he had spent years constructing. He understood better than anyone the fragility of the false paper trail he had built for Grace, and he knew that a single verified inconsistency could unravel the entire arrangement. Rather than waiting to be exposed, he attempted to seize control of the narrative himself, quietly feeding a distorted version of events to a handful of sympathetic outlets, suggesting that Amelia had reappeared in Mason's life purely for financial gain now that his fortune had multiplied many times over. The story spread with the particular cruelty reserved for wealthy men and the women once connected to them, and within days Amelia found herself the subject of harsh and often baseless speculation from strangers who knew nothing of what she had actually endured. She bore it with quiet exhaustion rather than surprise, having long ago learned that the public rarely extended grace to women in her position. Mason wanted to respond publicly and forcefully, to correct every distortion with the full weight of his resources, but Amelia asked him instead to hold back, insisting she would not allow herself to be paraded in front of strangers as either a victim or a trophy of his redemption. Mason honored her request, though it cost him considerable restraint, and instead directed his legal team to pursue David Morgan through quieter and more effective means. Their investigation soon turned up a former employee of the Carter household who had left years earlier under difficult circumstances and had, remarkably, kept a recorded conversation between Grace and David discussing the exact terms of the plan to force Amelia out of Mason's life permanently. David attempted to buy the former employee's silence once he learned of the recording's existence, offering a substantial sum in exchange for its permanent destruction, but the employee refused, having carried the weight of that secret with genuine discomfort for longer than David ever suspected. With the recording secured and cross-referenced against the falsified financial documents his team had already gathered, Mason finally possessed everything necessary to expose the conspiracy in full. He made the decision not to release the material to the press, despite the damage David had inflicted through public speculation, choosing instead a more precise and deliberate reckoning. He called for a formal meeting of the Carter family board, the same room where major decisions about the company's future had always been made, and he prepared to lay every piece of evidence before the people who had allowed his mother's deception to stand unchallenged for years. In the days leading up to the meeting, Mason found himself unusually quiet during his visits with Amelia and Lucas, his mind occupied with the precision required to dismantle a scheme that had operated undetected for so long. Amelia noticed the shift but did not press him for details, sensing that whatever burden he carried was one he needed to resolve on his own terms. She told him only that she trusted his judgment about how to handle David Morgan and the fallout from the false story circulating about her, a small statement of confidence that meant more to Mason than she likely realized, given how rarely anyone had trusted his judgment about matters this personal. The Carter family board convened on a gray morning in a conference room, lined with portraits of relatives who had built the company's reputation across several generations. Grace arrived composed and immaculately dressed, still clinging to the belief that whatever accusations Mason intended to raise could be managed the way she had managed every difficult moment throughout her life, with poise and carefully chosen words. She reminded the room, before Mason had even begun, that everything she had ever done was intended to protect the family's future and shield her son from what she considered an unsuitable entanglement. Mason did not raise his voice. He simply began presenting the evidence his team had assembled, methodically and without embellishment, laying the falsified settlement documents beside the genuine financial records that contradicted them, playing the recorded conversation between Grace and David Morgan for the entire board to hear in full. The room grew progressively quieter as the recording continued, Grace's own voice detailing a plan to convince Amelia that Mason had abandoned her, David's voice confirming the fabricated paperwork designed to convince Mason the opposite was true. There was no ambiguity left once the recording ended, no space remaining for the explanations Grace had relied upon her entire life. Amelia had been invited to attend, not to plead her case or seek sympathy from people who had never respected her, but to reclaim in person the dignity that had been stolen from her for 7 years. She sat quietly at the far end of the table, watching as the truth she had known privately for so long was finally acknowledged in a room full of people who could no longer pretend otherwise. David Morgan, confronted directly with his own recorded voice, offered no meaningful defense, and the board moved swiftly to sever every professional tie connecting him to the family's affairs. Grace, for the first time in Mason's memory, appeared genuinely shaken rather than merely inconvenienced. Mason informed her, calmly but without any softness left in his tone, that she would be removed entirely from oversight of the family trust, a consequence the remaining board members did not contest given what they had just witnessed. He told her plainly that he had not lost Amelia because of poverty or unworthiness, but because of his own family's arrogance, a distinction he needed his mother to understand fully even if she never fully accepted it. Amelia rose from her seat before the meeting concluded and left the room without a word, needing no dramatic confrontation to prove a point that the recording itself had already made undeniable. Mason remained behind briefly, watching as the board members filed out in uneasy silence, several of them avoiding his eyes entirely, aware that their years of quiet deference to Grace had allowed her judgment to go unquestioned for far too long. He felt no satisfaction in his mother's downfall, only a heavy, complicated relief that the truth had finally been forced into daylight after 7 years of careful concealment. As he gathered his papers and prepared to leave the conference room, he understood that exposing the conspiracy was only the first step, and that the harder work of rebuilding trust with Amelia and earning a place in his son's life still lay entirely ahead of him. In the weeks following the board meeting, Mason made a deliberate choice not to force his way into a role he had never earned. He did not ask Lucas to call him father, understanding that such a title had to be given freely rather than requested, and that Lucas owed him nothing simply because a test had confirmed their connection. Instead, Mason began showing up in small, unremarkable ways, driving Amelia to her follow-up appointments, arranging quiet repairs to the apartment's aging plumbing and heating, ensuring that neither she nor Lucas ever again faced an emergency without support, all without drawing attention to his own generosity. Amelia watched him closely during those weeks, wary at first, still bracing for the version of Mason his family's actions had once convinced her existed. But day after day, she noticed a consistency in his behavior that she had not expected, an absence of grand declarations replaced by steady, unglamorous reliability. He never used his wealth as leverage, never reminded her of what he had done for her, never treated his help as a debt she owed him in return. Slowly, without either of them naming it directly, something like trust began forming again between two people who had spent 7 years believing the other had chosen to walk away. Mason also made a significant decision regarding his own fortune, quietly divesting a portion of his more extravagant holdings in order to establish a fund dedicated to supporting single mothers who found themselves trapped between financial hardship and predatory legal pressure, exactly the circumstances that had once nearly destroyed Amelia's health and stability. He did not publicize the fund for personal credit, preferring instead that it operate with the same quiet consistency he was trying to bring to his relationship with Lucas. Lucas, for his part, remained cautious but increasingly comfortable, and one particular evening became a quiet turning point neither adult mentioned aloud afterward. The three of them sat together in the small living room, while rain tapped gently against the window, and Lucas, without any prompting, climbed onto the couch beside Mason rather than beside his mother, settling in as though the choice required no thought at all. Mason sat perfectly still, afraid to disturb whatever fragile comfort had allowed that small movement to happen naturally. Amelia watched from across the room, and for the first time since that stormy night in the hospital corridor, she allowed herself to believe that the man beside her son might genuinely be someone different from the one she had spent years resenting. Later that night, after Lucas had fallen asleep, Amelia sat with Mason on the small balcony outside her apartment, both of them quiet for a long while, listening to the last of the rain tapering off into a light and steady drizzle. She told him she was not ready to promise anything permanent, that trust rebuilt slowly could just as easily fracture again if either of them grew careless, and Mason agreed without protest, understanding that patience was the only currency capable of repairing what his family's deception had broken. They sat together without needing to fill every silence with words, a small but significant shift from the tense, guarded conversations that had defined their early weeks back in each other's lives. Several months passed before Amelia felt strong enough, both physically and emotionally, to begin building something new out of everything she had survived. She opened a small counseling center dedicated to helping women navigate financial hardship and legal exploitation, drawing directly from her own painful experience to guide others through similar circumstances. Mason supported the effort from behind the scenes, providing resources and connections whenever asked, but he made certain never to overshadow her leadership, understanding instinctively that this was her achievement to build and her name that deserved to be attached to it. Grace eventually sent a written apology, carefully worded and clearly the product of long reflection, acknowledging the harm her actions had caused both Amelia and her own son. Amelia read the letter in silence and did not respond immediately, unwilling to offer forgiveness simply because it had finally been requested after 7 years of silence. She told Mason honestly that healing was not something that could be rushed on someone else's timeline, and Mason, having learned a great deal about patience over the preceding months, did not push her to feel otherwise. David Morgan faced formal legal consequences for his role in fabricating evidence and later attempting to intimidate a witness into silence, consequences that finally arrived years after the damage he caused had already reshaped 2 lives beyond recognition. The proceedings offered Amelia a measure of closure, though she often said privately that the true resolution had come earlier. In the quiet moment, Mason knelt before her and finally believed what she had always known to be true. On a clear afternoon many months after that first stormy night, Mason brought Amelia and Lucas back to the very hospital where everything had begun, not for any medical reason, but simply to mark how far they had traveled since then. The same corridor stretched before them, though this time it held none of the desperation that had once filled it. Lucas reached for his mother's hand out of old habit, and then, without hesitation, reached for Mason's hand as well, linking the three of them together in a small, unremarkable gesture that nonetheless undid something in Mason that had remained frozen for years. Mason felt tears rise unexpectedly, the kind of emotion he had spent a lifetime training himself to suppress in every boardroom and negotiation he had ever walked into. He understood, standing in that quiet hallway, that family was not something reclaimed through power or wealth or clever legal maneuvering, but through patience, honesty, and the willingness to remain present long after the dramatic gestures had faded. He looked at Amelia, no longer frozen by the past that had haunted him for 7 years, but trembling instead with quiet gratitude for a second chance he knew he did not fully deserve, and yet had somehow been given anyway. Outside, the afternoon light spilled gently across the parking lot where a storm had once raged the night. Everything changed between them, and Amelia allowed herself, for the first time in years, to imagine a future that did not require constant vigilance or quiet dread. Lucas tugged at both their hands, eager to move forward toward whatever ordinary afternoon awaited them, unaware of the full weight of the moment he had just created simply by reaching for two hands instead of one. Mason followed his son's lead, matching his small, hurried steps, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he walked forward without calculating a single outcome, content simply to be present in a life he had almost lost the chance to know. Some wounds take years to surface, and truths only reveal themselves once a person stops running from pain long enough to face it directly. Mason Carter spent 7 years believing he had lost everything to betrayal, when in truth he had lost it to silence, pride, and a family unwilling to admit its mistakes. Amelia Brooks carried that same silence alone, raising a son who deserved more than either of them realized until fate placed them back in the same hallway on a rainy night. What began as a stranger's plea became the slow, patient rebuilding of a family neither thought they would ever get back. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes second chances are worth fighting for.